Hey guys, tonight we're going back to one of the oldest and most painful unsolved cases in Australian history. 3 children, a brother and his 2 sisters, who walked out their front door on a hot January morning, caught a bus to the beach the way they had done 100 times before, and were never seen again. Jane was 9 years old, Arnna was 7, and Grant was 4. They went to Glenelg Beach near Adelaide on the 26th of January, 1966, and somewhere in the bright middle of an ordinary summer day, they vanished from the most public place imaginable, surrounded by hundreds of people, and no one has ever been able to say with certainty what happened to them. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you, truly, for all of the case suggestions that bring stories like this one to light. We're also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there while you fall asleep tonight. Now, dim those lights. Get comfortable. This is a long one, and the story of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont deserves to be heard slowly and carefully, the way you would want someone to tell the story of a child you loved. These were not characters in a mystery. They were 3 real children who liked the water and the sand, who held hands when they walked, who were shy around strangers and gentle with each other. Their mother kept their bedrooms much the way they had left them for a very long time. Their parents waited the rest of their lives for a knock at the door that never came. Let's step back for a moment, because to understand what happened, we have to go back to the beginning, before the search parties and the headlines and the decades of silence. Have you ever wondered how 3 careful, sensible children could walk away from a crowded beach in broad daylight and simply be gone? Have you ever wondered what a whole country does with a wound that never closes, a question that is asked again and again for 60 years and never answered? And have you ever wondered who the tall, fair-haired man at the water's edge really was, the one the children seemed so comfortable with, the one no one was ever able to name? To begin to understand any of it, we first need to know who these 3 children were. So let's go back to a modest house on Harding Street in the seaside Adelaide suburb of Somerton Park in the middle of the 1960s. This is where the Beaumont family lived. Grant Beaumont, known to everyone as Jim, was the father. He was a former serviceman who had worked as a taxi driver, and by 1966 made his living as a travelling salesman, driving long routes through the towns of South Australia, selling his goods. Nancy Beaumont, his wife, kept the home and raised the children. The 2 of them had married in December of 1955, and in the years that followed, they had 3 children, close together, each about 2 years apart. The eldest was Jane Natare Beaumont, born in September of 1956. By the summer of 1966, she was 9 years old, and by every account, she was the kind of older sister who took her role seriously. She was described as shy, sensible, and protective, the one her parents trusted to look after the younger 2. She was careful with money and careful with time. When her mother told her to be home by a certain hour, Jane was the kind of child who remembered, who watched the clock, who shepherded her brother and sister back the way they had come. If you have ever been the oldest child or known one, you understand the particular weight that sits on a 9-year-old who has been told she is in charge. Jane carried it well. The middle child was Arnna Kathleen Beaumont, born in November of 1958, which made her 7. Arnna was the talker, the more outgoing of the two girls, the one more likely to chatter about her day at the dinner table. It was Arnna who said something, in the days before the children disappeared, that no one thought much of at the time, a small remark that would later take on an unbearable weight. We will come back to that. For now, it is enough to know that she was a bright, sociable little girl, the sort who noticed things and mentioned them, the kind of 7-year-old who is the easy center of a family's everyday noise. And the youngest was Grant Ellis Beaumont, born in July of 1961, which made him 4 years old that summer. He was the baby of the family, the only boy, small enough that on a long, hot day at the beach, his big sisters would have kept half an eye on him at all times. 4 is the age of complete trust. A 4-year-old believes the world is safe because the people he loves have always kept it that way. Grant had no reason to think the 26th of January would be any different from the dozens of beach days that came before it. Picture the 3 of them together, because they were almost always together. The careful older sister, the chatty middle girl, the little brother trailing behind. When witnesses later described seeing them that day, again and again, the same small detail surfaced, that they were holding hands, that they were laughing, that they moved through the world as a unit. That is who they were, 3 children who belonged to each other. The Beaumont home was an ordinary one for its time and place. Somerton Park sat just down the coast from the city of Adelaide, a quiet residential suburb of modest houses and wide streets, close enough to the sea that you could smell the salt on a warm evening. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew the local shopkeepers, where children played in the street until the light failed, where a mother could send her kids off for the morning and not feel a flicker of worry. To understand this case at all, you have to understand that world, because it is a world that in many ways ended on the day these children disappeared. You're standing on a footpath in Somerton Park in January of 1966. The heat is already rising off the road by mid-morning. That dry, heavy Australian summer heat that presses down on everything. A few houses down, a sprinkler ticks across a brown lawn. Somewhere, a screen door bangs. There are children everywhere, on bicycles, in front yards, walking in small loose groups toward the water with towels over their shoulders, and not one adult is watching them, because not one adult feels they need to. This is the ordinary backdrop of the Beaumont children's lives. The freedom of it is almost impossible to imagine now, and that freedom is precisely the thing that makes what happened so hard to bear. In the 1960s, in Australia and in much of the world, it was simply normal for children to roam. A 9-year-old taking a bus across a few suburbs with her younger siblings was not seen as a risk. It was seen as independence, as a child growing up the way children were supposed to. Parents taught their kids the route, handed them the bus fare, told them when to be home, and trusted the rest to a community that, for the most part, watched out for its own. Jane, Arnna, and Grant had made the short trip to Glenelg Beach many times. They knew the bus, they knew the foreshore, they knew the shops along the main road. The beach was a familiar second home to them, and there was no reason on earth to think of it as anything else. To be fair to Jim and Nancy Beaumont, and this matters, because over the years some people have unfairly wondered how parents could let 3 such young children go off alone. They were doing exactly what every other parent around them was doing. They were not careless. They were not neglectful. They were ordinary, loving parents living by the ordinary rules of their time in a country that had not yet learned to be afraid. The tragedy of this case is not that they did something unusual. The tragedy is that they did something completely normal, and it ended in a way that no one could have imagined. Let's talk about the days right before the 26th, because the disappearance did not come out of nowhere. It came at the end of a long, hot stretch of summer, and there were small details in those final days that would later make investigators wonder how long this had truly been building. It was the height of an Adelaide heat wave. Temperatures were climbing well into the high range day after day, the kind of weather that makes a beach the only sensible place to be. On the 25th of January, the day before the children vanished, their father Jim was preparing to leave on a 3-day work trip. He was a traveling salesman, and his routes took him out of the city for days at a time. Before he left, he drove the 3 children down to Glenelg Beach so they could swim and cool off. Then he set out north for the town of Snowtown to begin his rounds. He would not be home again until the afternoon of the 26th. So on the morning the children disappeared, their father was already away, on the road somewhere in rural South Australia, with no idea that anything was wrong. Their mother Nancy was at home in Somerton Park, going about the routines of a hot holiday morning. The next day, the 26th of January, was Australia Day, a public holiday, which meant the beach would be even busier than usual, crowded with families escaping the heat. To 3 children who loved the water, the idea of going back to Glenelg on a holiday, on a blazing hot day, with the whole long afternoon ahead of them, must have felt like the best plan in the world. Now picture Glenelg itself, because the beach is almost a character in this story. Glenelg was, and still is, one of Adelaide's most beloved seaside spots, a stretch of pale sand along Holdfast Bay, with a long jetty reaching out into the gentle water. There was a tram and a bus that ran down to the foreshore, a busy main street called Jetty Road, lined with shops and cafes and bakeries, and grassy public areas near the sand where families spread their towels, and children ran through sprinklers in the heat. On a hot Australia day, the place would have been alive with people, hundreds of them, families, couples, teenagers, old men reading newspapers in the shade, mothers with prams, lifesavers on the sand. It was, by any measure, one of the safest possible places a child could be. There were eyes everywhere, and that is one of the quiet, disturbing truths at the heart of this case. Whatever happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont did not happen in some dark and lonely place. It happened in the open, in the sunshine, in the middle of a crowd. It happened in plain sight, and yet no one saw enough to save them, and almost no one saw enough to explain it afterward. You're at Glenelg Beach on the morning of a heatwave holiday in 1966. The sand is already hot underfoot. The water is flat and bright and full of children shrieking in the shallows. Transistor radios play here and there along the foreshore. The smell of salt and sunscreen and hot pavement hangs in the air. Somewhere a vendor is selling cold drinks and ice cream, and the queue is long. This is the ordinary, happy chaos of an Australian summer, the kind of day that ends for almost everyone with sunburn and tired children and sand in the car. For 3 children, it ended in a way no one has ever fully understood. There is a grassy public area near the beach called Collie Reserve, just back from the sand, with lawns and shade, and on that day, a sprinkler running to cool the grass in the heat. Children played there, darting in and out of the water. It is an unremarkable place, the kind of spot you would pass without a second glance. But Collie Reserve is where some of the last confirmed sightings of the Beaumont children took place, and it is where, for the first time, a stranger enters their story. Before we go there, hold on to the image of who these children were. Jane, the careful one, 9 years old, watching the time. Arnna, 7, bright and talkative. Little Grant, 4, trusting the day completely. 3 children who had done this 100 times, who knew the way home, who held hands when they walked. They woke up on the morning of the 26th of January in their own beds, in their own house, in a neighborhood that loved them. And by that evening, they were gone. Let's go back to that morning and walk through it as carefully as anyone can, because the hours between when the children left home and when they were last seen are the most important hours in this entire case. Everything that is known, every theory anyone has ever offered, every dig and every search comes down to a handful of sightings spread across a single summer day. We need to lay them out slowly, in order, and notice both what they tell us and what they leave unexplained. On the morning of the 26th of January, Australia Day, the children asked their mother if they could go to Glenelg again. It was already hot, climbing toward another scorching day, and Nancy agreed. Because it was too warm to walk the distance, they would take the bus, a short ride of about 3 kilometers that took only 5 minutes from a stop near their home down to the foreshore. Nancy gave them money for the trip, 6 shillings and sixpence, enough to cover their bus fare both ways and to buy some lunch while they were there. She told them to be home on the noon bus. Jane, the careful one, would have heard that and tucked it away. Be home by 12. They left the house and caught the bus at 8:45 in the morning. 3 children with their towels and their swimming things, climbing aboard for a journey they had made many times on a holiday morning, off to spend the day at the beach. The bus driver who took them down would later be part of the record of that day, one more ordinary adult who saw 3 ordinary children doing an ordinary thing. None of them could have known they were watching something that would never be undone. They arrived at Glenelg sometime before 9 in the morning, and for the next few hours they did what children do at the beach. They swam, they played in the sand, they wandered the foreshore in the rising heat, and at some point that morning, near the grassy lawns of Collie Reserve, witnesses began to notice something. The 3 Beaumont children were in the company of a man. Here is what those witnesses described, and it is worth being precise, because this description has shaped every theory in the 60 years since. The man was tall. He had fair to light brown hair and a thin face with a sun-tanned complexion and a slim to athletic build. He appeared to be somewhere in his mid-30s. He was wearing swimming trunks, and he was with the children near the sprinklers at Collie Reserve, and the children, by every account, looked completely at ease with him. They were playing, relaxed and unhurried, enjoying themselves. There was nothing in their manner that suggested fear or reluctance or that anything was wrong at all. Now, sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most haunting details in the case. Jane Beaumont was a shy child. Her parents said so plainly. She was not the kind of girl to run off and play with a strange grown man she had never met. And yet here she was, with her brother and sister, comfortable in this man's company, treating him not as a stranger, but as someone familiar. That single fact reshaped how investigators understood everything, because if the children were that comfortable, then perhaps this was not the first time they had met him. This is where a small remark, made days earlier and forgotten almost as soon as it was spoken, came rushing back. In the time before the disappearance, the children had been to Glenelg without their parents on other occasions. And at home, at some point, Arnna had said something to her mother. She said that Jane had got a boyfriend down the beach. Nancy thought nothing of it. She assumed Arnna meant a playmate, another child, the kind of harmless friendship that springs up between kids over a summer. She took no further notice. Why would she? Children make friends at the beach. It is the most natural thing in the world. But after the children vanished, that small sentence became one of the hardest pieces of the entire puzzle to sit with. Have you ever wondered how a careful, sensible child could walk away with a stranger in broad daylight? The terrible possibility is that to Jane, he was not a stranger at all. The theory that investigators came to favor is that the children had met this man on a previous visit to the beach, that he had been patient, that he had won their trust slowly over more than one day, so that by the 26th of January, he was a familiar and welcome face, a friend from the beach, someone it felt safe to play with. If that is true, then what happened to the Beaumont children was not a sudden snatching. It was something far more deliberate and far more patient, and that is a hard thing to hold in your mind. There is another detail from Collie Reserve that has never been fully explained. At one point, the man approached one of the other people nearby and asked a question. He wanted to know whether anyone had been near the children's belongings because, he said, their money was missing. Their towels and clothes were laid out on the grass the way beachgoers leave their things, and the man was raising the concern that some of the children's money had gone. It is a small thing, an odd thing, and to this day, no one is entirely sure what to make of it. Some have wondered whether it was a way of inserting himself into the children's trust, of playing the role of a protective adult looking out for them. Others have wondered whether the money truly had gone missing, and whether that mattered later. We do not know. It is one of many threads in this case that leads nowhere certain. After a while, the man left the children to go and change out of his swimming things, and the children waited for him. Think about that. They waited. They did not gather their things and head home. They stayed because they expected him to come back, the way you wait for a friend. And then, sometime later, the group was seen leaving the beach together. Police would later estimate this happened at around 12:15 in the afternoon, which means the noon bus, the bus their mother had told them to be home on, had already come and gone. Jane, the careful one, the clock watcher, was an hour past her curfew and walking away from the beach with a man instead of heading home. For a child as reliable as Jane, that is profoundly out of character, and it tells you how completely they trusted whoever they were with. Let's talk about what happened next, because the timeline now becomes both more detailed and more troubling. There is a sighting that places the children with the man well into the afternoon. A witness named Daphne Gregory reported seeing the children in the man's company at around 2:45 in the afternoon, and she noticed something specific. The man was carrying an airline bag, a small travel bag, similar to one that belonged to Jane. A detail like that sticks because it suggests the man was now carrying the children's belongings, that they were still together hours after they had first been seen, that whatever was unfolding was unhurried and ongoing across the whole long afternoon. And then there is the bakery, which gives us what is widely regarded as the last truly confirmed sighting of the children, and which contains one of the strangest and most significant clues in the case. On Mosley Street in Glenelg, there was a bakery called Wenzel's. The Beaumont children were known there. They had been in before, and the shopkeeper recognized them. On the day they disappeared, Jane came in and bought food. She bought pasties, and she bought a meat pie, and she paid for it with a £1 note. To understand why that £1 note matters so much, you have to remember what Nancy Beaumont had given her children that morning: 6 shillings and 6pence. In the currency of the time, that was a modest amount, enough for bus fare and a simple lunch, and nowhere near a full pound. A pound was a significant sum for 3 children to be carrying. So the obvious and unavoidable question is, where did the pound note come from? The children had not left home with it. Someone gave it to them, and the most likely someone, given everything else that day, was the man they were with. The shopkeeper noticed something else too, something only a person who knew the children would have caught. In all their previous visits, the Beaumont children had never bought a meat pie. It was not what they ordered. And now here they were, buying more food than usual, including something they had never bought before, paying with money they had not left home with. To investigators, all of it pointed the same direction. The children were not alone, and they were being provided for by an adult. They were buying lunch, perhaps for themselves and perhaps for someone else, with money that had been handed to them. The ordinary act of a child buying a pie became, in hindsight, one of the clearest signs that the 3 of them had fallen under the care or the control of the man from the beach. That visit to Wenzel's bakery is, for many who have studied this case, the last moment we can be reasonably certain the Beaumont children were alive and accounted for. After that, the trail begins to fracture, because there is one more sighting, and it is the one that has caused investigators the most difficulty, the one that does not quite fit with the rest. A postman who knew the Beaumont children well reported seeing them at around 2 to 3 in the afternoon. He said they were walking alone, the 3 of them, away from the beach and along Jetty Road, heading in the general direction of their home. And he said they were holding hands and laughing, just the 3 children on their own, apparently happy, apparently heading home at last. For a moment, that sounds almost reassuring. The children alone, no man in sight, walking toward home of their own accord. But it raises questions that have never been answered. Why were these reliable children, by now hours late, strolling along unconcerned instead of rushing home in a panic about how much trouble they would be in? Where was the man? And how does a sighting of the children, walking happily home, alone, fit with everything else we know, with the bag, the bakery, the pound note, the long afternoon spent in a stranger's company? It gets more complicated still. The postman, who had given this statement, came back to police 2 days later and said something that changed his account. He now thought that he might have seen the children in the morning, not in the afternoon as he had first said. This is the kind of honest human uncertainty that bedevils a case like this. A reliable witness, a man who genuinely knew the children, recalling a fleeting moment from an ordinary day that only became significant after the fact, and then, on reflection, no longer sure of when exactly it happened. Was it morning? Was it afternoon? The difference matters enormously, and it can never now be resolved. This is where the timeline breaks down, and where, in a very real sense, the children disappear from history. Somewhere in the afternoon of the 26th of January, 1966, after the bakery, after the man, after the walk along Jetty Road, Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont stopped being people who were seen and became people who were searched for. There is no confirmed sighting after that day, no reliable trace. 3 children who had been visible all morning in a crowd in the sunshine simply slipped out of the world, and the long silence began. Reported sightings of the children would continue for about a year afterward, all over the place, none of them ever confirmed, each one raising and then dashing the hopes of a family and a country. But the real story of the 26th of January ends in the early afternoon on a hot street in Glenelg, with 3 children last seen holding hands. After that, there is only the question. Let's go back now to Somerton Park, to the house on Harding Street, where their mother was waiting. Because while all of this was unfolding at the beach, Nancy Beaumont had no idea that anything was wrong. She was simply a mother at home on a hot holiday, expecting her children back for lunch. The noon bus came. The children were not on it. Now, on its own, that was not yet cause for alarm. It was a holiday, the beach was wonderful, and children lose track of time on days like that. A parent learns to absorb a little lateness without panic. Nancy would have told herself they had stayed in the water a bit longer, that they would be on the next one. So she waited for the 2:00 bus. The 2:00 bus came. The children were not on it either. And this is the moment, somewhere in that quiet afternoon, when a mother's ordinary patience begins to curdle into something colder. 2 missed buses. 3 children who, for all their love of the beach, were generally reliable, led by a daughter who watched the clock. The afternoon was wearing on. The worry that had been easy to push away in the morning was becoming harder to ignore. You're Nancy Beaumont, standing in your kitchen in Somerton Park as the afternoon heat presses against the windows. The clock on the wall says it is well past 2. You have looked out the front window more than once. You have told yourself a dozen reasonable things. They are fine. They are playing. They will walk in any minute, sunburnt and full of stories. But the house is too quiet, and the buses have come and gone, and the small animal part of a parent's mind has started to whisper. You do not yet know that the worst thing imaginable has already happened. You only know that your children are not home, and the day is getting late. Jim Beaumont, the children's father, was due back from his sales trip that afternoon. He arrived home early at around 3 in the afternoon, and he walked into a house where his wife was now seriously frightened and his 3 children were nowhere to be found. There was no long discussion. Jim got back in his car and drove straight to Glenelg to look for them himself. He searched the crowded beach. He walked the foreshore in the heat, scanning the hundreds of faces, looking for 3 small familiar ones among the strangers. He checked the places the children would go, the spots they knew. He found nothing, no sign of them anywhere. He drove home, and he and Nancy together searched further, going to the houses of friends, checking anywhere the children might conceivably be, telling themselves with every stop that surely they would turn up, surely there was an explanation. There was none. At around 5:30 in the evening, with the long summer light beginning to soften and their children still missing, Jim and Nancy Beaumont went to the Glenelg police station and reported that Jane, Arnna, and Grant were gone. To be fair to the police of 1966, their first response was the natural one. They assumed, as anyone would have, that the children were simply nearby and had lost track of the time. 3 kids at a busy beach on a holiday, late getting home. The most likely explanation, by far, was that they were still out there somewhere, that they would be found within the hour, tired and hungry and a little sheepish. So a search was quickly organized of Glenelg Beach and the areas around it, expecting at any moment to turn up 3 children who had simply wandered too far. But the children were not nearby. As the search widened and the evening wore on, the assumption of a simple delay began to give way to something far more serious. The search expanded out to the sandhills, to the buildings near the foreshore, and out into the ocean itself, in case the unthinkable had happened in the water. The airport was watched, the rail lines were monitored, the roads leading out of the state were placed under attention. Within hours, the police were no longer looking for 3 children who had lost track of time. They were confronting the possibility of an accident or a kidnapping or something worse, and the machinery of a major search was grinding into motion. Within 24 hours, the entire nation knew the disappearance of 3 children from a crowded beach on Australia Day struck a nerve in a way few stories ever had. It was on every front page, on every radio bulletin. People who had never met the Beaumont family found themselves thinking about those 3 children constantly, scanning the descriptions, looking twice at any group of kids who matched. The country had taken the case into its heart almost overnight, and it would never quite let it go. Within 3 days, on the 29th of January, the tone of the coverage had darkened sharply. The Adelaide Sunday Mail ran a headline that said a sex crime was now feared. The hope that the children had simply gotten lost, or run away, or had some innocent adventure, was collapsing. The fear that had no name on the first day now had one, and it was the worst fear a parent or a community can hold. And yet, strangely, the initial official reward offered for information was modest. Only 250 Australian pounds, a figure that in hindsight seems almost painfully small against the scale of what had happened. The reward would grow over the years, eventually into the millions. But in those first days, no one yet understood that this would not be solved in a week, or a month, or a lifetime. There was an early lead that seemed urgent at the time. A woman told police that she had spoken with 3 children, matching the description of the Beaumonts near the Patawalonga boat haven at around 7 o'clock on the evening of the disappearance. The Patawalonga was a body of water near Glenelg, and on the 29th of January, police took the extraordinary step of draining it, sending cadets and an emergency operations group to search the area thoroughly once the water was gone. It was a grim and desperate measure, the kind of thing you do when you are afraid of what you might find. They found nothing. The boat haven gave up no trace of the children. It was the first of many searches that would end exactly that way, with nothing, and the family was left to absorb the first of countless cycles of dread and false hope. Let's talk about the investigation that followed, because what unfolded over the weeks and months and years after the 26th of January became one of the largest police operations in Australian history, and also, in many ways, one of the most frustrating. The scale of it was enormous. The result was nothing, and in the gap between those two facts lies much of the heartbreak of this case. In the immediate aftermath, the search was vast. Police and volunteers combed the beach, the sandhills, the streets, the vacant lots, the foreshore, the water. Members of the public turned out in their hundreds to help, walking shoulder to shoulder across open ground, peering into culverts and drains and abandoned buildings. The story was everywhere. And so the tips poured in, thousands of them, from people who were certain they had seen the children here or there or somewhere else entirely. Every one of those tips had to be chased down, and every one of them, in the end, ran dry. A possible sighting in one suburb, a group of children spotted at a railway station, a man and 3 kids seen getting into a car. Each lead flickered with hope and then went dark. It is worth pausing to be fair to the investigators of the time, because it is easy, 60 years later, to look back and catalogue everything that went wrong. The truth is more complicated. The police in 1966 were working without most of the tools we now take for granted. There was no DNA analysis. There were no databases linking offenders across states. There were no mobile phones to trace, no security cameras on the streets and shop fronts, no way to reconstruct a person's movements through digital traces. There was the painstaking, old-fashioned work of knocking on doors, taking statements, following leads on foot, and hoping that someone, somewhere, had seen the thing that mattered. By the standards of their era, the police took the case extremely seriously and devoted extraordinary resources to it. But they were trying to solve a modern kind of crime with the tools of an earlier age, and the gap between the two was a chasm the children fell straight through. There were also, in honesty, decisions made in those early days that investigators would later regret. The crowd at the beach had been enormous, and many potential witnesses simply went home before anyone thought to take their names. Witness accounts were gathered in the chaos and the urgency, and memories shifted, as the postman's did, in the days that followed. The description of the man, while consistent in its broad strokes, was the description of an ordinary-looking person, tall and fair and thin-faced, the kind of description that could fit thousands of men. There was no single piece of physical evidence tying any specific person to the children. Whoever the man was, if he existed as a single individual at all, he left almost nothing behind. As the weeks turned into months with no answer, the case began to attract a different kind of attention, the kind that grows around any mystery that refuses to be solved. And in November of 1966, that attention took one of its strangest turns. A Dutch man named Gerard Croiset, who was famous in Europe as a psychic, was brought all the way to Australia to assist in the search for the Beaumont children. He had a reputation, in certain circles, for helping to locate missing people, and in the desperation that surrounds an unsolved case involving children, the idea of bringing in a celebrated clairvoyant found support. His arrival caused an enormous stir in the press. For a time, the search for the Beaumont children became, in part, a spectacle, with a foreign psychic at its center and the whole country watching to see whether he could do what the police could not. He could not. By most accounts, Croiset's efforts produced nothing of value. His impressions shifted from day to day, The story he told seemed to change, offering no firm clue that led anywhere. But he did fix on one location. He became convinced that the children's bodies were buried at a particular spot, inside the remains of an old brick kiln at a warehouse not far from the children's home. He pointed to that place and said that was where they would be found. The property owners were understandably reluctant to tear apart their building on the word of a psychic, and at first they refused. But the publicity around Croiset's claim had built enormous public pressure, and it did something remarkable. Members of the public, gripped by the case, raised a sum of around $40,000 to have the building demolished and the ground beneath it searched. The owners relented, and the site was excavated, and there was nothing there at all. No remains, no trace of the children, no evidence connected to the Beaumont family in any way. The whole episode had been a costly, painful detour, fueled by hope and grief and the human longing for an answer, and it ended the way nearly every lead in this case ended, with empty ground. That same site would be searched again, properly, decades later. In 1996, the building that Croiset had identified was undergoing partial demolition, and the owners allowed a full search of the location. Once more, the ground was opened. Once more, there was nothing. Whatever happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont? They were not in the place the psychic had named, and the failure of that search, 30 years on, was its own quiet kind of cruelty, reopening an old wound to find the same emptiness underneath. Have you ever wondered what it does to a family to live through cycle after cycle of this? A lead emerges, a search is announced. For a few days or weeks, there is the unbearable, electric possibility that this time there will be an answer, that the not knowing might finally end. And then the ground is opened, or the water is drained, or the witness is interviewed, and there is nothing, and the family is sent back to the silence to wait for the next time. Jim and Nancy Beaumont lived inside that cycle for the rest of their lives. Every new lead was a fresh hope and a fresh grief folded into one. It is difficult to imagine a more exhausting way to carry a loss. And then, about 2 years after the children disappeared, came perhaps the cruelest episode of all. The Beaumont parents received letters. 2 of them at first. One appeared to have been written by Jane, their eldest daughter. The other was written by a man who claimed that he was the one keeping the children. The envelopes carried a postmark from Dandenong, in the state of Victoria, far from Adelaide. The letters described a relatively pleasant existence. The notes referred to a person called the man, who was looking after the children. The letter from the man said that he had appointed himself the children's guardian, and remarkably, that he was now willing to hand them back to their parents. Imagine receiving that. After 2 years of silence, after the searches and the psychic and the dead ends, a letter arrives that appears to be in your daughter's hand, telling you she is alive, that she is being cared for, that she might be coming home. The forensic examination of the time could not rule the letters out. In fact, when the writing was compared with other samples of Jane's handwriting, police at the time believed the letters could quite plausibly be authentic. So a meeting was arranged. The man's letter had nominated a place where the children could be returned. Jim and Nancy went to the designated meeting place with a detective following them, watching from a distance in case this was the moment, in case their children were finally about to be handed back. They waited, and no one came. The meeting place stayed empty, and then, some time later, a third letter arrived, again purporting to be from Jane. This one said that the man had realized a detective was present at the meeting in disguise, and that because the Beaumonts had betrayed his trust by involving the police, he had decided to keep the children after all. And with that, the letters stopped. There were no more. The door that had seemed for a few impossible weeks to be cracking open was slammed shut again, and the family was left worse off than before, having been allowed to believe their children might be alive and then having that belief used against them. For years, the letters sat in the file as a genuine uncertainty. Were they real? Had the children truly been alive 2 years on, kept somewhere by a man who toyed with their parents through the post? It was not until 1992, with fingerprint technology that had improved dramatically since the 1960s, that the truth came out. New forensic examination of the letters showed that they were a hoax. They had not been written by Jane at all. The author was identified as a man who, by then, was 41 years old, which meant that at the time he wrote the letters, in the late 1960s, he had been a teenager who, for reasons known only to himself, had written to a grieving family pretending to be their missing daughter and her captor, and had drawn them out to an empty meeting place and had then written again to twist the knife. Because so much time had passed, he was never charged with any offense. Sit with that for a moment, because it tells you something about the gravity that this case exerted, even on strangers. The disappearance of these 3 children pulled cruelty out of people who had nothing to do with the crime itself. The hoaxer was not the man from the beach. He had no knowledge of what had actually happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant. He was simply someone who saw a famous tragedy and chose to make it worse for no reason anyone could ever fully explain. And in doing so, he stole years of a family's peace and sent investigators down a path that led nowhere. This became the shape of the Beaumont investigation over the long decades, not a single dramatic failure, but a slow accumulation of dead ends, false hopes, well-meaning mistakes, cruel hoaxes, and searches that opened the ground and found nothing. The tips never fully stopped. Even many years later, the police continued to receive information about the case, each piece carefully assessed, most of it leading nowhere. The file stayed open. It has never been closed. And through all of it, the central question remained exactly as unanswered as it had been on the evening of the 26th of January, when Jim and Nancy first walked into the Glenelg police station to say that their 3 children were gone. Which brings us to the hardest part of the story to tell with care. Over the 60 years since the children disappeared, a number of men have been named, suspected, investigated, and in some cases publicly accused of involvement in their disappearance. None of them has ever been charged with it. None of them has ever been proven to have had anything to do with it. Every one of them is connected to the case by resemblance, by circumstance, by suspicion, and by theory, and not by proof. We are going to walk through them because they are part of the story and you deserve to understand the full picture. But it is essential, all the way through, to hold on to a simple principle. Suspicion is not guilt. Resemblance is not evidence. Several of these men are dead and cannot answer for themselves, and at least one of them was defended to the end by his own family as an innocent man. We will name them and lay out what is alleged, and we will be just as clear about what is not known as about what is. Let's start with the man whose name has hung over this case for decades, Bevan Spencer von Einem. To be clear from the outset, von Einem was never charged in connection with the Beaumont children, and there has never been any proof that he was involved. What is true, and what is a matter of public record, is that in 1984, he was convicted of the murder of a teenage boy named Richard Kelvin, the son of an Adelaide newsreader, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Police and prosecutors publicly stated their belief that von Einem had not acted alone in a series of crimes against young men in Adelaide, crimes that became known in the press as the family murders. He was a convicted killer, and that is a fact. The connection to the Beaumont case is more tenuous, and it rests on a few threads. Around the time of his conviction, police came to suspect that von Einem might have been involved in the Beaumont disappearance, in part because he bore a resemblance to the descriptions and the identikit images of the unidentified man from 1966. During the investigation into him, police heard from an informant they would only identify as Mr. B. According to Mr. B, von Einem had once spoken of having taken 3 children from a beach years earlier and had made disturbing claims about what he had done to them. The account was deeply unsettling, and it described things that, in some respects, echoed details from the coroner's findings in von Einem's known crimes. But there are serious problems with treating this as a solution, and the police themselves recognize them. Von Einem was born in 1946, which means that in 1966 he was only around 20 years old. The man seen with the Beaumont children was described consistently as being in his mid-30s. That is a substantial difference, and it is difficult to reconcile. The Beaumont children were also much younger than the teenage and young adult men von Einem was believed to have targeted. A killer changing the age and type of his victims so dramatically is unusual, though not impossible. Mr. B was considered a generally reliable source in other matters, but some of the details he relayed about the Beaumont case did not fit the known facts, and police regarded parts of his account with real skepticism. As recently as a confidential police report in 1989, von Einem was named as a suspect, and as of more recent years, he had not been formally ruled out. But suspicion is all it ever was. He was never charged. He maintained no cooperation on the matter, and he died in 2025 without the question ever being resolved. Whatever von Einem did or did not do, the case against him in the Beaumont matter remained a theory, never a proof. Let's talk about another man whose name appears in the file, Arthur Stanley Brown. Again, the same caution applies, and it applies in full. Brown was never charged in the Beaumont case, and there is no evidence connecting him to Adelaide in 1966. What drew attention to him was a separate and terrible matter. In 1998, Brown was charged with the murders of 2 young sisters, Judith and Susan Mackay, who had disappeared on their way to school in Townsville, in the state of Queensland, in 1970, and were later found dead. Brown bore a striking resemblance to the identikit images of the suspect in both the Beaumont case and a later case we will come to. That resemblance is what put his name in the conversation. But the resemblance is, once more, where it ends. Investigators looked for any connection between Brown and the Beaumont children and found none. There were no employment records that could establish where he was in early 1966, in part because some records were thought to have been lost in a major flood in 1974, and in part because Brown, who had access to government buildings, may have had the opportunity to dispose of his own files. There is no proof he ever visited Adelaide at the relevant time, and crucially, the arithmetic does not work. Brown was born in 1912, which made him around 53 years old in 1966. The man with the children was described as being in his 30s. That is a gap of 2 decades. Brown was, in the end, never tried for the Mackay murders either, because he was found to be suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's disease and deemed unfit to stand trial. He died in 2002. Whatever the truth of his other case, his link to the Beaumont children rests on a likeness and nothing more. There is a third name, James O'Neill, and here the story takes a slightly different shape. O'Neill was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of a 9-year-old boy in Tasmania in 1975. He is reported to have told several acquaintances over the years that he was responsible for the Beaumont disappearance, and a former detective named Gordon Davey spent 3 years getting to know him before featuring him in a documentary that attempted to link him to the case. O'Neill never gave a clear confession. When asked directly, his answers were slippery and evasive, neither admitting nor truly denying, the kind of non-answers that can sound like guilt and can equally be the games of a man who enjoys the attention. He claimed never to have visited Adelaide, though his work in the opal industry would likely have taken him through the city at times. What matters most here is the official conclusion. The South Australia police interviewed O'Neill and discounted him as a suspect in the Beaumont case. For all his ambiguous remarks, the people responsible for solving this crime looked at him closely and ruled him out. A fourth man, Derek Percy, was suggested as a possible suspect in a newspaper article in 2007. Percy was a convicted child killer and for a long time, Victoria's longest-serving prisoner. But the difficulty with Percy is straightforward. He was born in 1948, which made him only 17 years old at the time the Beaumont children disappeared. The man at the beach was described as a grown man in his 30s. A 17-year-old does not fit that description, and Percy's candidacy, like the others, founders on the basic facts. He died in 2013. Notice the pattern across all 4 of these men. Each one is connected to the case primarily by resemblance to a vague description, or by their proven involvement in other crimes against children, and each one, when examined closely, runs into a wall of facts that does not fit. The wrong age, no proof of being in the right place, an official decision to rule them out. This is what happens in a case with almost no physical evidence and a description that could match thousands of people. The mind reaches for known offenders, for men capable of terrible things, and tries to fit them into the empty space at the center of the story. But fitting is not the same as proving, and none of these men has ever been shown to have been the man on the beach, which brings us to the suspect whose name has come to dominate the modern conversation about this case, a man called, in a book about him, the Satin Man. His real name was Harry Phipps, and here, more than anywhere, we have to be careful, because Harry Phipps was never charged with anything related to the Beaumont children. He died in 2004 before most of these allegations were even public, and his own family has been divided over his memory, with one son accusing him and another defending him as an innocent man. What follows is what has been alleged and investigated. It is not a verdict. No court has ever reached one. Harry Phipps was a wealthy local figure, a factory owner, and a member of Adelaide's social elite. He was born in 1917, which placed him in his late 40s in 1966, somewhat older than the man described at the beach, though closer to that description than several of the other suspects. What drew attention to him, decades after the fact, was a combination of circumstances that some have found compelling and others have found far from conclusive. He lived very close to Glenelg Beach, only a few 100 meters away, on the corner of Augusta Street and Sussex Street. He was known to bear a resemblance to the identikit of the man seen with the children. He was reportedly in the habit of handing out £1 notes, which, given the mystery of the pound note that Jane used at the bakery, struck many people as significant, and he was later alleged to have been a man who abused children, though this, like much else, came forward only long after his death. The name Satin Man entered the story through a book published in 2013, which examined Phipps as a possible suspect without initially naming him. Soon after the book appeared, his estranged son, Hayden, publicly identified his father as the Satin Man. Hayden made a number of claims. He said that he had seen 3 children at the family house on the day of the disappearance. He said that he had been violently abused by his father as a child. Hayden had first come forward to researchers in 2007, some years before the book, with his account of having seen the children in his father's yard on the 26th of January. Hayden was 15 years old at the time the children vanished, and he carried whatever he carried for the rest of his life. He died in 2015. It is important to be fair and complete here, because a family torn apart by such an accusation deserves that fairness. Harry Phipps had another son, Wayne, who has defended his father's innocence. Wayne has said that his brother Hayden was mentally ill and has rejected the idea that their father was responsible for the disappearance of the Beaumont children. So at the very heart of the modern case against Harry Phipps is a family divided against itself, one son accusing and one son defending, with the accused man long dead and unable to answer either of them. That is not the foundation of a conviction. It is the foundation of a tragedy layered on top of a tragedy. There was, however, one set of claims about Phipps that did rise to the level of prompting official action, and it is the reason his name is tied to the most significant physical searches the case has seen in this century. 2 men came forward, who had been youths at the time, and said that in the days after the children disappeared, Harry Phipps had paid them to dig a large hole, a grave-sized hole, at one of his factory sites. By their account, it took the better part of a weekend, because the ground was sandy and the sides kept collapsing. Others who had worked at the factory reportedly said that Phipps would often stand and stare at one particular spot on the grounds, on at least one occasion removing his hat and holding it to his chest, as though in some private moment of reverence or remembrance. Taken together, these accounts pointed at a specific place in the ground, and they were serious enough that, to the real credit of the police, they were not dismissed. They were investigated, and that investigation meant digging. Let's talk about the digs, because the claims about Harry Phipps and the grave-sized hole led to the most concrete, physical searches the case has seen in modern times, and each one tells you something about how this case refuses to resolve. The site at the centre of it was a factory in the Adelaide suburb of North Plympton, a place associated with the new Castelloy works on land that had been connected to Phipps. If the children were buried where the two former youths said they had dug, this was where they would be, so investigators went looking. The first search came in November of 2013. A small section of the factory site, about 1 square metre, was excavated. Before the digging, ground-penetrating radar was used to scan beneath the surface, the kind of technology that can hint at disturbances or objects hidden in the soil. The radar found what was described as one small anomaly, something that might indicate movement or an object within the ground. It was enough to justify opening the earth, but when the dig went ahead, it found nothing of significance, no remains, no evidence connected to the children. The anomaly, whatever it was, did not turn out to be them. After that, the investigation into that particular site was closed, but it did not stay closed. In January of 2018, Adelaide detectives announced that they would return to the same factory site for further excavation, prompted by a privately funded investigation that had been sponsored by a television network in Adelaide. This time the dig took place on the 2nd of February and it lasted around 9 hours. The crew went down to a depth of roughly 1.5 meters. What they pulled out of the ground was, in its own way, heartbreaking in its ordinariness. Animal bones, general rubbish, the kind of debris that accumulates on an old industrial site over decades. Nothing that had anything to do with Jane, Arnna, or Grant Beaumont. The second dig, like the first, ended in nothing. You might think that would be the end of it, that after 2 excavations of the same ground, both finding nothing, the site would finally be set aside. But this is the Beaumont case, and the not knowing has a way of pulling people back. In February of 2025, based on what was described as new and reliable information, a third search was organised at the same location. This one was privately funded and championed by a South Australian Member of Parliament named Frank Pangallo. The argument for digging again was specific. Eyewitness accounts, along with photographs of the site taken back in 1966, compared against the present-day landscape, suggested that the area searched in 2018 had been covered over with additional soil of a different texture and density, perhaps an extra 1.5 meters of it, laid down at some point after the original digs the two men described. In other words, the theory went, the earlier searches simply had not gone deep enough. The children, if they were ever there, might lie beneath a layer of fill that had been added later. So the trees were cleared, and the ground was opened a third time, and the search ran for about a week. And once again, after 60 years and 3 excavations of the same patch of earth, there was nothing, no remains, no answer. The Castelloy site, like the brick kiln the psychic had named, like the boat haven that was drained in the first week, gave up only silence. It is worth saying plainly what this means and what it does not mean. The repeated failure to find the children at the Phipps factory does not prove that Harry Phipps was innocent, and it does not prove that he was guilty. It proves only that the children were not found there. The men who said they dug a hole may have been mistaken about where, or the ground may have been disturbed and the contents moved, or their account may have been wrong in some way, or it may have been right, and the answer simply lies a little deeper or a little to one side, in ground no one has yet opened. We do not know, After 3 digs, the most honest thing anyone can say about that factory site is that it has not answered the question, and the question remains exactly where it has always been. Now picture the family at the edge of each of these searches. By 2013, by 2018, by 2025, the world had moved on in almost every way. But for the people who loved these children, every dig was the same agonizing ritual, the announcement and the preparation and the cameras and the unbearable, treacherous flicker of hope that this time the ground would finally give them something to bury, something to grieve over properly, an end to the not knowing. And then the same word, again and again. Nothing. It is hard to think of a crueler pattern, and harder still to imagine living inside it for the better part of a lifetime. There is one more case we have to talk about, because the police and the media have long suspected it may be connected to the Beaumont disappearance, and because the 2 children at its center deserve to be named alongside Jane, Arnna, and Grant. On the 25th of August, 1973, 7 years after the Beaumont children vanished, 2 more young girls disappeared in Adelaide, and the circumstances were eerily familiar. Their names were Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirsta Gordon. Joanne was 11 years old. Kirsta was 4, the same age that Grant Beaumont had been. They were at the Adelaide Oval, a large sporting ground in the city, attending an Australian rules football match with their families on a winter afternoon. The 2 families were sitting together in the stands, enjoying the game, and the adults let the 2 girls go off to the toilet together, the way you would at any crowded public event. 11-year-old Joanne, the older girl, was looking after little Kirsty, much as Jane Beaumont had once looked after her younger siblings. The 2 girls left their families, and they never came back. In the 90 minutes that followed, witnesses reported seeing the girls several times around the oval. They were spotted trying to coax a stray cat. They were seen in the company of other children. And then, in the sightings that have haunted the case ever since, they were seen with an unknown man, a man carrying the younger girl, with the older girl appearing distressed and following along behind. The people who saw this did not understand what they were watching. They assumed naturally that it was a father with his children, a tired 4-year-old being carried, an older sister trailing after. There was no reason to intervene. The last reported sightings placed the girls some distance from the oval, near the zoo, near a railway station, moving away from where they had started. And then, like the Beaumont children before them, they were simply gone. The parallels are difficult to ignore. 2 cases, 7 years apart, in the same city. Children disappearing from crowded, public, supposedly safe places in broad daylight. An older child looking after a younger one. An unidentified man. No bodies ever found, and no one ever charged in either case. South Australia police and the media have long suspected that the same person might have been responsible for both, and some of the suspects discussed in the Beaumont case, including von Einem, have also been linked by resemblance to the man seen at the Oval. But it has to be said, just as clearly here as everywhere else in this story, that there has never been solid evidence connecting the 2 cases. The link is a suspicion, born of similarity and proximity and the human instinct to find a pattern in tragedy. It may be true, it may not. Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirsta Gordon have their own families, their own unanswered questions, their own long shadow, and they remain missing to this day. They deserve to be remembered in their own right, and not only as a footnote to another case. Let's step back and talk about something larger, because the disappearance of the Beaumont children was not only a private tragedy for one family, it was a moment that changed a nation, and that change is part of why this case has never faded. Before the 26th of January 1966, Australia, like much of the Western world, lived by a particular and now almost unimaginable assumption. The assumption was that children were safe, not safe because anyone was watching them, but safe because the world itself was understood to be a fundamentally safe place for them to move through. Children walked to school alone. They roamed their neighborhoods in packs until the streetlights came on. They caught buses and trams across the city without an adult. They spent whole unsupervised days at the beach. Parents did not hover because hovering was not seen as necessary. The danger that we now teach every child to be wary of, the stranger, the unfamiliar adult with a kind word and an offer, was not absent from the world, but it was not yet a part of the everyday consciousness of ordinary families. The threat lived at the far edges of imagination, in rare and distant stories, not in the bright middle of a holiday afternoon at the local beach. The Beaumont case ended that. It did not end it with a law or a policy. It ended it with a feeling, a slow, cold realization that spread across the country in the weeks and months after 3 children vanished from Glenelg. If it could happen to the Beaumonts, sensible and careful and ordinary as they were, in a place as crowded and familiar and safe as Glenelg Beach on Australia Day, then it could happen anywhere, to anyone, to your children. That thought, once it entered the national mind, could not be removed. Parents who had never given a second thought to letting their kids roam began, for the first time, to be afraid. They started driving children where they had once let them walk. They started asking where they were going and with whom and when they would be back. They started, in 1,000 small ways, to pull their children closer and to watch the strangers around them with a new and permanent wariness. To be fair, this change did not happen overnight, and the Beaumont case was not the only force behind it. But of all the things that contributed to the end of that older, freer, more trusting way of raising children in Australia, the disappearance of Jane, Arnna, and Grant is the one that people point to most often, the one that crime writers and historians describe as the moment the country lost a certain innocence. It is sometimes said to be the case that taught Australians to lock their doors. There is grief in that, beyond the grief for the children themselves, because the freedom those 3 children had on the morning of the 26th of January, the freedom to catch a bus to the beach and spend a whole bright day in the sun without an adult in sight, was a real and beautiful thing, and it is a freedom that the children who came after them would never quite know in the same way. In a sense, the Beaumont children were among the last to live in that older world, and their disappearance is part of what closed the door on it. Have you ever wondered whether we lost something when we became so careful? It is not a simple question. The carefulness protects children, and that is real and good. But there was something tender and trusting in that older world, in a community that assumed it would watch out for its own, in a childhood spent roaming free, that is genuinely gone, and the Beaumont case sits right at the hinge of that loss. 3 children paid for the rest of us to learn a lesson none of us wanted to learn. That is a heavy thing to carry, and it is one more reason their story has stayed with the country for 60 years. Let's talk about what this did to the people who loved them, because the disappearance of the Beaumont children was not an event that happened on a single day in 1966. It was a wound that stayed open for the rest of two parents' lives, and the way Jim and Nancy Beaumont carried that wound is, in its own quiet way, one of the most affecting parts of the whole story. Think about the position they were placed in. Most grief, however terrible, eventually has a shape. There is a death, and a body, and a funeral, and a grave you can visit. There is a hard, clear edge to the loss, and over time, with that edge to push against, the bereaved can begin, however slowly, to build a life on the other side of it. The Beaumonts were denied even that. They had no death to mourn, because they had no proof their children were dead. They had no grave to visit. They had no certainty of any kind. For decade after decade, they lived in the impossible space between hope and grief, never able to fully give up on the chance that their children might walk back through the door, and never able to truly stop grieving them either. Psychologists have a name for this kind of suffering. They call it ambiguous loss, the grief that has no resolution, the mourning that cannot be completed because the thing being mourned has no end. Few families in Australian history have lived inside that condition as long or as publicly as Jim and Nancy Beaumont. In the early years, they did what any parents would do. They held on to hope with everything they had, and one of the ways they held on to it was almost unbearable in its tenderness. For nearly 2 decades, the Beaumonts stayed in their home in Somerton Park, the same house on Harding Street that the children had walked out of on the morning of the 26th of January. They stayed, in part, because they could not bear to leave the place their children would look for if they ever came home. As long as the family was at that address, there was a thread, however thin, connecting the children to the world they had vanished from. To move would be to cut that thread, to make it harder for Jane or Arnna or Grant to find their way back, so they stayed, year after year, in the house full of their children's absence, waiting. You're in that house in the years after 1966. The 3 children's rooms are still there. Their things are still where they left them. The afternoon light moves across the floor the way it always did, and the street outside is full of other children growing up, riding bikes, heading to the beach, while these 3 rooms stay frozen at the ages of 9 and 7 and 4. Every knock at the door is a small detonation of hope and dread. Every ring of the telephone could be the call. Most of them are nothing, or worse than nothing, a reporter, a crank, a well-meaning stranger with a sighting that will lead nowhere. But you cannot stop answering, because the one time you do not answer might be the time it matters. This was the texture of the Beaumonts' daily life for years. Ordinary domestic routine, laid over a permanent, humming undercurrent of waiting. And the false hopes kept coming, again and again, because a case this famous never truly goes quiet. There were the reported sightings that continued for about a year after the disappearance, each one investigated, each one fading. There was the psychic and the warehouse and the $40,000 raised to demolish a building that held nothing. There were the hoax letters, that monstrous 2-year cruelty that dangled their living daughter in front of them and then snatched her away. Over the longer span of years, there were occasional claims that the children had been seen alive, grown up, living somewhere overseas, the kind of theory that surfaces around any disappearance and that offers a strange, painful comfort and an even sharper disappointment. There were the renewed searches, the brick kiln dug again in 1996, the factory dug in 2013 and 2018 and 2025. Through all of it, the police kept the file open and the tips kept arriving, and Jim and Nancy kept being asked over and over across the decades to summon hope and then to survive its collapse. The reward for information grew over the years, a quiet measure of how much the case still mattered to the state and to the public. The £250 offered in those first frightened days eventually became, in the modern era, a reward of $1 million for information leading to a conviction or to the recovery of the children's remains. That figure still stands. It is, in a sense, a strange kind of monument, a number that says we have not given up, even though 60 years have passed and almost everyone who was an adult at the time is now gone. Someone, somewhere, may still know something. The reward waits for them. The strain of all this on a marriage is something we can only imagine, and it is not our place to judge it. At some point in the long years that followed, Jim and Nancy Beaumont separated and later divorced. It would be wrong and unkind to read that as any kind of failure. They had been handed a grief that no marriage is built to withstand, a grief without end, lived under the constant glare of public attention, with no answer ever to share and no closure ever to reach together. That two people might eventually need to face that in their own separate ways is not a scandal. It is simply human. They lived apart in their later years, and at some point they sold the house in Somerton Park, the house they had clung to for so long, because at last the children were not coming back to it, and life, what was left of it, had to go on somewhere. To be fair to both of them, even as they stepped back from the relentless public glare, they never simply walked away from the case. They kept the police informed of where they were living, year after year, so that if there were ever news, if the ground ever gave up an answer, they could be found and told. Think about what that means. It means that for the rest of their lives, decades after the disappearance, they remained ready at any moment to receive the call that would finally tell them what had happened to their children. They were waiting still, just more quietly, the hope worn down to something thin and durable, but never quite extinguished. And there was one more terrible thread of the case that touched them in the years between. The second dig at the Castelloy factory in 2018 was carried out at the request of Nancy Beaumont herself, an old woman by then, in her 90s, still pushing for the ground to be opened, still hoping that this time it might give her something to hold. It did not. Nancy Beaumont died in 2019 in an Adelaide nursing home at the age of 92. She had spent 53 years not knowing what became of Jane, Arnna, and Grant. Jim Beaumont died a few years later, in 2023, in Adelaide, at the age of 97. Between them, they had survived more than half a century of the cruelest uncertainty a parent can be asked to bear, and they went to their graves, both of them, without ever learning the truth. They never found out who the man at the beach was. They never found out where their children went, or what was done to them, or where they might rest. The question that detonated in their lives on the evening of the 26th of January, 1966, was still unanswered when each of them drew their last breath. People close to the case have said it plainly. They went to the grave not knowing, and it is the not knowing more than anything that eats away at the people left behind. There is a particular sorrow in the fact that the parents are now gone. For as long as Jim and Nancy were alive, there was at least the possibility that an answer might still reach them, that some deathbed confession or some forgotten witness or some final dig might give them peace before the end. That possibility is gone now. Whatever the truth of what happened to the Beaumont children, it can no longer be delivered to the people who needed it most. If the case is solved tomorrow, the two people who waited longest and hardest for that solution will not be here to receive it. The answer, when and if it ever comes, will arrive at an empty house. And yet the search has not stopped, even with the parents gone. That third dig at the factory happened in 2025, 6 years after Nancy's death and 2 years after Jim's. The people pushing for it were no longer the parents, but others who had taken up the case, a member of parliament, researchers, men who had grown up in Glenelg and were the same age as the Beaumont children would have been, who have spent years of their own lives trying to find the answer. There is something both moving and sad in that. The Beaumont children have been gone for so long that the people now searching for them are, in many cases, strangers, carrying a torch lit by a tragedy that happened before they were grown. The case has outlived its victims, outlived their parents, and become a kind of inheritance passed from generation to generation of South Australians who simply cannot let 3 children stay lost. Have you ever wondered why a case like this holds a country so tightly for so long? Part of it, surely, is the children themselves, 3 innocents lost on a sunny day. Part of it is the public nature of it, the way they vanished from a crowded beach in front of everyone and no one. But part of it, I think, is the open wound of the not knowing. A solved tragedy, however awful, can eventually be set down. An unsolved one cannot. It stays live year after year because the question is still genuinely open, because there is still, in theory, someone out there who knows. The Beaumont case has never been allowed to become history because history is finished and this is not finished. The file is still open. The reward still stands. And somewhere, the answer still exists, even if everyone who could once have given it is gone. Let's go back for a moment to those first days and weeks, because the search for the Beaumont children was not a quiet police matter. It was one of the largest and most emotional public mobilizations the state had ever seen, and the sheer scale of it tells you how completely the case had seized hold of everyone. In the hours after the children were reported missing, the response was immediate and grew quickly. What began as a handful of officers walking the foreshore expanded within a day into something enormous. Police searched the beach end to end. They moved out into the sandhills behind it, combing the dunes by hand. They searched the buildings near the foreshore, the change rooms, the jetty, the boats moored in the haven. Divers went into the water in case the unthinkable had happened in the sea or in the boat haven, working through the murk for any sign of 3 small bodies. The airport was placed under watch. The rail lines were monitored. The roads leading out of South Australia were given attention in case the children had been carried across a state line. It was the kind of search you mount when you have no idea what you are looking for, and so you must look everywhere at once. And it was not only the police. The public came. They came in numbers that are hard to imagine now. Ordinary men and women who had never met the Beaumont family, turning out to walk in long lines across open ground, to search vacant lots and scrubland and culverts, to knock on doors, to scan the faces of every group of children they passed. The story was on every front page and every radio bulletin within a day, and so the whole community became, in effect, a search party. People who lived nowhere near Glenelg found themselves driving slowly past parks, looking twice at any man walking with children, holding the descriptions of Jane and Arnna and Grant in their minds as they went about their days. For a time, the entire state was looking, and still, with all of those eyes, with all of that goodwill and effort, there was nothing to find. The children had not wandered off into a place that a search could reach. Wherever they were, the searchers walked past it again and again, and never knew. The tips came in their thousands, and everyone had to be chased. Someone was certain they had seen the children at a railway station. Someone else had seen 3 kids matching the description getting into a car. A man had been spotted walking with children in a distant suburb. Each lead flared with possibility and then went dark, and behind each one was a family being asked, once more, to hope. It is exhausting just to describe, and the people doing the work lived inside that exhaustion for months. To their credit, the investigators did not treat the case as routine. They poured resources into it on a scale that reflected how much it mattered. But effort is not the same as success, and all that effort, in the end, ran into the same wall that everything in this case runs into. The children were gone, and the world had kept almost no record of how. Let's talk about the witnesses, because they are easy to overlook, and they carry a particular kind of weight in a case like this. Almost everything we know about the last hours of the Beaumont children comes from a small number of ordinary people who happened to see them on what they thought was an ordinary day. None of these people knew in the moment that they were watching something that would matter. They were simply living their lives, and the children crossed their field of vision, and only later, when the news broke, did they realize that they held a fragment of one of the most important days in the state's history. Think about the bus driver who took 3 children down to Glenelg at 8:45 that morning. To him, they were 3 of the countless passengers he carried on a busy holiday, unremarkable, forgotten, almost as soon as they stepped off. And then, days later, he would have understood that he was very likely one of the last people to see them in the safe, ordinary part of their last day, before anything went wrong. Think about the people at Collie Reserve who noticed the children playing with a tall, fair-haired man near the sprinklers, who registered nothing alarming because there was nothing alarming to register. Just a man and some children enjoying the water on a hot day. They had no reason to study his face, to fix his features in memory, to note where he went. Why would they? It was only afterward that their casual, half-formed impressions became some of the only description anyone would ever have of the man who may have taken 3 lives. Think about Daphne Gregory, the witness who saw the children with the man at around 2:45 in the afternoon and noticed the airline bag, similar to one of Jane's, that he was carrying. A small observation, the kind you might make and never think of again. And yet it became a thread in the timeline, a marker placing the children still in the man's company hours into the afternoon. Think about the shopkeeper at Wenzel's Bakery, who knew the children well enough to notice that they had bought something they never bought before, and to remember the £1 note, a detail that has shaped the entire investigation. And think, especially, about the postman, who knew the Beaumont children and saw 3 of them walking and laughing and gave his honest account, and then, 2 days later, troubled and uncertain, came back to say he was no longer sure whether it had been the afternoon or the morning. There is no villain in that. There is only the ordinary fallibility of human memory, the way a glimpse on a busy day will not hold its shape when you press on it later, especially when the weight of 3 missing children has been laid on top of it. This is the fragile foundation on which the whole case rests. Not documents, not recordings, not images, but the imperfect recollections of a handful of strangers who happened to be in the right places at the right times and did not know it. In a modern case, there would be cameras on the shop fronts and the street corners, footage from the bus, digital traces of movement, 100 forms of evidence that simply did not exist in 1966. Here, there was only what people remembered, and memory, as gentle and as honest as it tried to be, was not enough. To be fair to every one of those witnesses, they gave what they had. It is not their fault that what they had could not bring the children home. Let's talk about what happened to this case over the long decades, because a story this large does not stay still. And the way it has lived on in the public mind is its own kind of testament to the children at its center. The Beaumont case has never been allowed to fade. It has been written about in books, examined in documentaries, revisited in newspapers on every significant anniversary. Each new generation of South Australians grows up knowing the names Jane, Arnna, and Grant, even those born decades after the disappearance, because the case is woven so deeply into the place that it has become a kind of shared memory, passed down like a family story, except the family is an entire state. Every so often, a new piece would surface, and the whole thing would come alive again. A new suspect would be named. A new witness would come forward. A book would be published, like the one that introduced the world to the figure called the Satin Man, and suddenly the case would be back on the front pages, and the old grief would be turned over once more in the public light. The television networks took an active role, at times funding their own investigations, pushing for the digs at the factory site, keeping the case in front of the public when it might otherwise have gone quiet. There is something complicated in that, in the way a private tragedy becomes a piece of public property, examined and re-examined, theorized over by people who never knew the children. But there is also something valuable in it. As long as the case is talked about, it is not closed. As long as the names are spoken, the children are not forgotten. And the possibility, however slim, that some piece of attention might one day shake loose an answer is worth keeping alive. The anniversaries became markers in the life of the state. The 50th in 2016, half a century since the children walked onto that bus, was met with renewed coverage, fresh appeals, and a kind of collective taking stock of how long the question had gone unanswered. By the 60th, in 2026, almost everyone who had been an adult in 1966 was gone, and yet the case still drew attention, still moved people, still felt unfinished in a way that 60-year-old events almost never do. There are very few crimes that hold a country this way, decade after decade, long after the trail has gone cold and the principles have died. The Beaumont case is one of them, and the reason is not the mystery, though the mystery is real. The reason is the children, 3 of them small and ordinary and loved, lost on a sunny day and never found. That is what people cannot let go of. That is what keeps the file open and the reward standing and the searchers digging 60 years on. Let's sit for a little while with the questions themselves, because after 60 years, and countless theories, what remains most striking about this case is how many small, ordinary details still refuse to fit together, and how each of them points toward a truth that has never quite come into focus. Start with the man. Everything turns on him, and yet he is almost nothing, a sketch, a handful of consistent impressions from people who saw him only in passing on a busy day. Tall, fair-haired, thin-faced, sun-tanned, athletic, in his mid-30s, in swimming trunks. That description has been laid against the faces of suspect after suspect, and parts of it have fit several of them, and all of it has fit none of them with certainty. The trouble is that it is a description of an ordinary man. There were a great many tall, fair, sun-tanned men in their 30s on the beaches of Adelaide in the summer of 1966. Whoever he was not memorable in the way that might have saved the children. He was the kind of man you would not look at twice, and that, perhaps, was exactly the point. Then there's the most unsettling detail of all, the one that suggests this was no sudden, opportunistic snatching. The children were comfortable with him. Shy Jane, careful Jane, was relaxed enough to play with him, to wait for him while he changed, to walk away from the beach in his company an hour after she should have been on the bus home. Arnna's small remark that Jane had got a boyfriend down the beach suggests this was not the first time. If that is true, then the man had been there before, on earlier visits, patiently making himself familiar, turning himself from a stranger into a friend. That is a kind of premeditation that is hard to even think about. It means that on those earlier, ordinary beach days, while the children played and their parents felt no fear, someone was already at work, slowly and deliberately earning the trust that he would one day use. It means the danger was present long before the day anyone noticed it. We cannot prove this is what happened, but the children's ease with him is one of the most solid facts in the case, and it is very difficult to explain any other way. Then there is the money, the £1 note at Wenzel's bakery, where the children had only ever carried small change and had never bought a meat pie. The pound did not come from home. Someone gave it to them. The most reasonable reading is that the man gave it to them, that he was providing for them, feeding them, keeping them content and unafraid through the long afternoon. A £1 note in the hand of a child is a small thing, and yet it may be one of the clearest fingerprints the case has, evidence not of who he was, but of what he was doing, drawing the children in, making the day pleasant, keeping them with him by choice rather than by force. And then there is the timeline that will not quite resolve, the contradictions that have frustrated investigators from the very first week. The group seen leaving the beach together around 12:15, the sighting with the airline bag at 2:45, the postman who saw the 3 children walking alone and happy along Jetty Road at 2:55 with no man in sight, and who then, 2 days later, was no longer sure whether it had been the afternoon or the morning. How do you fit a sighting of the children alone and content, heading home, into a day that otherwise seems to be about a man slowly leading them away? Were they briefly on their own? Did they slip away and then return to him? Was the postman simply mistaken about the time, as he himself came to fear? These are not questions anyone can answer now. The witnesses are gone. The day is 60 years cold. The contradictions are frozen exactly as they were, and they may stay that way forever. Step back far enough, and you can see the broad shapes that the theories take. There is the possibility that the man was a local, an ordinary resident of the Glenelg area who knew the beach and its rhythms, who had been working on the children for some time, and who has simply never been identified, who lived out his life and died with his secret intact. There is the possibility, pursued for decades, that he was one of the named men, von einem or another, drawn into the frame by resemblance and by their proven capacity for harm, though every one of those men runs into facts that do not fit. There is the theory built around Harry Phipps, the Satin Man, the wealthy local who lived close to the beach and handed out pound notes and whose own son accused him, a theory that has prompted 3 excavations and yielded, so far, nothing but animal bones and old rubbish and the continued silence of the ground. And there is the hardest possibility of all to accept, which is that the answer may simply never be known, that the man took his secret to an unmarked grave decades ago, that the children lie somewhere no one has thought to look, and that this case will pass eventually out of living memory with its central question still open. To be honest about it, that last possibility grows more likely with every passing year. The trail was thin in 1966, when it was warm. It is colder now than it has ever been. Almost everyone who was an adult that day is gone. The parents are gone. Several of the suspects are gone. The witnesses are gone. What remains is a file, a reward that no one may ever collect, and the stubborn refusal of a state and a handful of dedicated people to call the case closed. There's dignity in that refusal, even if it never bears fruit. To keep searching for 3 children 60 years after they vanished is to insist that they still matter, that they were never just a famous mystery, that they were people whose disappearance is still worth answering for. Whether or not the answer ever comes, the searching itself is a kind of faithfulness. But let's not end on the man, or the theories, or the empty ground, because to do that would be to make the same mistake the headlines have always made, to let the mystery become bigger than the children at its heart. So let's bring it back, finally, to Jane and Arnna and Grant. Jane Natare Beaumont was 9 years old. She was shy and careful and responsible, the kind of eldest child who watched the time and shepherded her younger siblings and could be trusted to bring everyone home. She was the one her parents relied on. On the morning she disappeared, she was carrying that quiet responsibility the way she always did, looking after a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old on a hot day at the beach. She had her whole life in front of her, all of it, every ordinary and extraordinary thing a girl might grow up to be, and it was taken before it could begin. Arnna Kathleen Beaumont was 7 years old. She was the talker, the bright and sociable one, the child who noticed things and said them out loud at the dinner table. It was Arnna who mentioned, in passing, that her sister had a friend down at the beach, a small remark that no one could have known to fear. She was the middle child, the connector, the one who filled the house with chatter. She should have grown up to fill a great many more rooms with it. Grant Ellis Beaumont was 4 years old. He was the baby of the family, the only boy, small enough that his sisters kept him close and the world still felt entirely safe to him. He trusted everyone the way a 4-year-old does because no one had ever given him a reason not to. He was too young to understand danger, too young to protect himself, too young for any of this. He was a little boy at the beach with his big sisters on a sunny day, and that should have been the most ordinary and harmless thing in the world. Behind the case file, beyond the headlines, underneath every theory and every dig and every suspect's name, that is what was lost, not a mystery. 3 children, a daughter who was careful, a daughter who was bright, a son who was small and trusting, children who held hands when they walked, children who were loved completely and who were waited for by 2 parents for the rest of those parents' lives. They deserved to come home on the noon bus, sunburnt and tired and full of stories. They deserved to grow up. They deserved so much better than the silence that swallowed them. So tonight, as you sit with this story, maybe try to remember them, not for how they vanished, but for who they were. 3 children on a bright summer morning, climbing onto a bus, off to the beach, with the whole long day ahead of them. Remember that there was a world not so long ago where that was a perfectly safe thing for them to do. And remember that part of what we lost when we lost the Beaumont children was that world itself. And maybe, in their memory, hold the children in your own life a little closer, not out of fear, but out of love, knowing as we now do that the ordinary days are the ones that matter most, because you never know which of them you will wish you could have back. Where the case stands today is simply told. After 60 years, the disappearance of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont remains unsolved. No one has ever been charged. No trace of the children has ever been found, despite one of the largest and longest investigations in Australian history. The file is still open. A reward of $1 million still stands, waiting for an answer that may or may not ever come. Their parents are gone now, both of them, after more than half a century of waiting. The man who was last seen with them on that bright Australia day has never been named. The ground has been opened more than once and has given up nothing. And so the question that began on the evening of the 26th of January, 1966, when 2 frightened parents walked into the Glenelg police station, is the same question we are left holding tonight, 60 years later, in the dark. Somewhere, the truth of what happened to these 3 children still exists, and somewhere, perhaps, someone still knows. Their story is not finished. It has only gone quiet. And until it is finished, the least that any of us can do is to remember Jane and Arnna and Grant, not as a mystery to be solved, but as 3 children who were loved and who are still missed and who deserve to come home.